Before a judge decides a man's fate, before the gavel falls and a sentence is handed down, the people he hurt get one last chance to speak. This isn't about lawyers arguing over legal details. This is about raw, unfiltered truth. In the case of Sean Combs, two letters landed on the judge's desk that tell a story of absolute horror. One from the woman who says he controlled her for a decade, Cassie Ventura, and another from her parents. These letters are a desperate plea for justice, a final attempt to make the court understand the gravity of what they endured. And let me tell you, what they describe is a far cry from the great modern love story his defense lawyers tried to sell. So get this picture. For 4 days straight, Cassie stood in a packed courtroom, 9 months pregnant, and laid out the most traumatic chapter of her life. In her letter to the judge, she described how from the age of 19, Combs trapped her in a decade of abuse. She said he groomed her, forcing her into what she called her full-time job, performing with hired male workers during multi-day freak-offs that happened almost every single week. She was apparently forced into lingerie, told exactly how to look, and handed substances so he could control her like a puppet. It left her with illnesses, infections, and complete emotional exhaustion before he just demanded all over again. And why would anyone go through that? Well, according to her, refusing meant punishment. He would threaten to take her car, her phone, or even worse, destroy her reputation by leaking tapes he held over her head. This wasn't some kind of wild party lifestyle. She describes it as a prison where her only goal was survival. But the control he had over her went way beyond just threats. And when the threats weren't enough, she says the violence was always waiting. In her letter, she laid out a horrifying routine of being hit, punched, and even having her face stomped on. She described being thrown to the ground and slammed against walls. And this wasn't just her word against his. She made sure the jury saw the pictures. Bruises that covered her back from his kicks and a deep gash over her eye from where he apparently slammed her into a bed frame. But this is where the story gets a level of twisted that's hard to even process. She reveals in her letter that after these brutal beatings, makeup artists would be brought in. And get this, they were paid for by Sean Combs himself. It was a calculated system. His job was to break her, and their job was to cover up the evidence so she could be seen in public looking perfect. Talk about brand management. It's a level of manipulation that's just insane, basically telling her that even the pain on her face wasn't her own. It was just another problem for his PR team to solve. But then came the one piece of evidence his money couldn't erase. The entire world eventually saw it, but the courtroom watched it first, dozens of times. That cold, silent security footage from the hotel in 2016, you see him chasing her down a hallway, grabbing her and throwing her to the ground with sickening force. Then he just relentlessly kicks her body while she's curled up in a ball trying to protect herself. There's no sound, which almost makes it worse. It's just cold, brutal, and undeniable. So when his lawyers tried to paint a picture of a complicated romance, everyone in that room had seen the receipts. These weren't just a few bad nights. This was a pattern of calculated brutality, and the physical wounds were only half the battle. So you'd think the story ends there, right? The abuse stopped so she can just move on. But that's not how trauma works. In her letter, Cassie makes it crystal clear that this is a life sentence for her. She talks about still having nightmares and flashbacks every single day, forcing her to stay in therapy just to cope. Her fear is so real that she actually moved her family out of New York. She's terrified that if he walks free, his first move will be to come after her and the people who spoke out. The abuse didn't just leave scars on her body, it pushed her into substance use just to numb the pain and horror. It got so bad, she admits in the letter, that she nearly ended her own life. If her family hadn't stepped in, she might not be here to tell her story. This isn't just about what happened back then, it's about a terror that she lives with every single day. And she wasn't the only one writing to the judge. And if you thought Cassie's letter was intense, her parents turned up the heat even more. Regina and Roderick Ventura also wrote to the judge, and they didn't hold back one bit. They called the 11 years their daughter spent with Combs a horrific nightmare. From their perspective, they watched their daughter get held like a prisoner, someone who was repeatedly beaten and brutalized by what they called the defendant's power and depravity. They made it painfully clear that everything she did during that time wasn't consensual. It was pure self-preservation. She was just trying to survive. So you can imagine their absolute disgust when they read reports that Combs's defense team was suggesting a sentence of only 27 months, with time served. For them, the idea of him getting a little over 2 years for what they describe as an 11-year reign of terror was a complete and utter insult. And they had a very specific message for the judge about what a light sentence would truly mean. So in their letter, Cassie's parents basically spelled it out for the judge. They weren't just asking for a long sentence, they were explaining why anything less would be a slap in the face. They argued that giving him a sentence of mere months instead of years would send a dangerous message. And what's that message? That this kind of repulsive behavior can happen without meaningful consequence, especially when you're rich and powerful. They see a light sentence as a green light for other abusers, a sign that our justice system doesn't really take this stuff seriously. But then they hit the judge with the most powerful line in the entire letter. They wrote that to sentence him lightly would be to dismiss her very existence. Just think about that. They believe that a weak punishment is the court's way of saying that their daughter and the 11 years of hell she endured simply don't matter. They were pleading with the judge to deliver a sentence that actually reflects the severity of the nightmare she lived through. So after all the emotional testimony and the heartbreaking letters from the victims, you have to wonder if the people in suits were even listening. Well, it turns out the feds were paying very close attention, and they came back with a number of their own. Not the insulting 27 months that Combs's team was hoping for, but a number that carries some serious defiant weight, a minimum of 135 months in federal prison. That's over 11 years. The government prosecutors are essentially telling the judge that they believe the victims. They're backing up the stories of abuse, control, and trafficking with a demand for a sentence that reflects a decade of terror. They're making it clear that from their perspective, this wasn't just a toxic relationship that went sour. It was a criminal operation that deserves a punishment to match. So while Combs's lawyers were pushing for a sentence that some people spend on a long vacation, the government came back with a number that actually looks like a real consequence. This completely changes the game, leaving the judge with two wildly different paths to choose from. So when you strip it all down, what are we left with? These two letters aren't just legal documents, they're a desperate scream for acknowledgement. They represent the one chance for Cassie and her family to have their truth heard, not by the media, but by the person holding Sean Combs's future in his hands. They want the court to see past the celebrity and the money and look at the 11-year nightmare and the life sentence of trauma that she's been handed. This is their one shot to make sure the man who they say stole a decade of their daughter's life faces real consequences, not just a slap in the wrist. But it leaves you with a really heavy question. What does justice even look like here? How many years behind bars can actually balance the scales for that kind of damage? Can any number truly make up for a lost decade and a lifetime of fear? That's the question the judge has to answer.